Last week we talked about Abraham's family, and today we're going to talk about the Arab family, because that's also Abraham's family. We've spent the last 3 weeks in discussing Israel and the various aspects about Israel. We talked about the land. We talked about it being the center, in God's eyes, the center of the universe, so to speak, Israel. We also talked about the covenant that God made with Abraham and what he promised him, not only in the blessings but also in the land. And we also talked about the flourishing of the land when the rightful inhabitants were living in it again, and that's what certainly has happened in our days, in our lifetime, in most of our lifetimes. But there's other players in the end time story as well as Israel, even though Israel is one of the focal points of end time prophecy. And we're going to talk about some of that today, the other players. But most of these players, these other players, have not always got along with Israel. And in fact, sometimes they want to annihilate them and get them off the face of the earth, as the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, would say. They want to, before the United Nations, they want to wipe this country from the face of the earth and drive them into the Mediterranean Sea. Palestinians and Syrians and others that have really had a problem with Israel over time. And these incidences of struggle and warship almost, and continual conflicts didn't start in 1948 when Israel was reestablished as a nation. This story goes back almost 4,000 years ago. And it is still a conflict that's going on today. Most people, like you and me, are not at all surprised by what's going on in the Middle East, because you know what the Bible has to say about this conflict. That it started, this is a family feud, if you want to put it that way, a family feud that's been going on for 3,800 years. And it continues down to this day, and you who know the Bible know about that source and the beginning of it. And you'll also know that this started way back at Abraham's time, about 3,800, 3,900 years ago, when his wife, Sarai, he was called Abram at this time, Sarai talked to him about, and she started to do things that God had promised, but in her own strength. She started to do things that she thought God wanted to be done, but God wasn't doing. And so she suggested to Abraham that the promised child that God had promised to Abraham would be through Hagar, her handmaid, much younger than her. And Abraham agreed to that, and they had a child. And that child was called Ishmael by Hagar, the handmaid of Sarai. For many years after that happened, I'm sure that Abraham said to Ishmael, "You are the promised child. You are the one that's going to be receiving the benefits of God, as he promised." I am convinced that he thought that this was the child. And then in chapter 17, verse, I think, let me put it on the screen, verse 18, we find him talking to God. And now he's 99 years old, and Ishmael is 13 years old. And Ishmael is thinking he's the one that's going to be receiving the promise that God gave to Abraham. And it says here that, and Abraham said to God, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." Then God said, "Yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." So God is setting him straight that this isn't the child that is going to be blessed. It's going to be a child named Isaac that isn't yet born. And he continues in verse 21, verse 20 and 21, and by saying, "And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make of him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year." Now, when the child is born, Ishmael is 14 years old. And now he has lost any sign of him being the promised child. And I'm sure he's hurt. And we know the story, if you read the scripture, that he made it difficult for Isaac, much younger Isaac, 14 years younger, in Isaac's time, early childhood. And he made fun of him and mocked him and did everything he could to hurt him, not physically, but emotionally. And Sarah said, that can't happen any longer. So, sorry to say Moses, but Abraham was asked to send Hagar away. And they did. Now, I'll talk in a few seconds here about what God said to Hagar. But what we have here is the beginning of a family feud. This is where it began. The things that we see in the Middle East today are because of this. When we get in and try to take over God's plan, there's always problems. And we need to keep that in mind. And by the way, if you didn't hear the sermon the last hour, you need to get online and hear Pastor Troy, what he had to say. It was just outstanding, what we should be listening to. Amen. Just a word of caution, a word of help. We shouldn't think that the Arabs, some of which are from Ishmael, have no end-time future. The Bible has a lot to say about the end-time future of the Arab people under its various family names. And you might be surprised that there's considerable amount of prophetic writing among Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And almost the entire books of Obadiah and Nahum are concerning Arab families and Arab countries. And so the Bible has a lot to say. It's not just a passing future for them, but it's a contributing. And not only does God say he's going to judge them, but he's also going to bless them. So there's something going up that God has planned for the Arab people. Give you an idea of how often Arab people, by the different names that they have, are found in the Bible. We have Egypt mentioned 740 times, Moab 180 times, Ammon 115 times, Edom 120 times, Ishmael and Ishmaelites just 38, Arabs and Arabians 74 times, Midian 71 times. These are all different families of the Arab family, and Bible has a lot to say about each of these, and we'll talk about them starting today and next week. So today is the family, next week's what God says about the future for the Arab people. But the biblical story doesn't end with Isaac and Ishmael. The next generation, Isaac's sons, Esau and Jacob, they have trouble. Isaac kind of stole the birthright from Esau, and Esau, at least he looked like it. He looked at it like that, and he hated Jacob so much that he was out to kill him, get rid of him. And for some time, for many years, Jacob had to flee for his life and be estranged from his family for a number of years. Esau became also known as Edom. And his family are known as the Edomites. And most of those today, or back then in biblical times, were in what is southern modern-day Jordan. East of the Dead Sea, south from there, towards the desert area. The first time the word Arab or Arabian is found in the Bible, just in case you want to know, is in 2 Chronicles 7, verse 11. 17, verse 11. You should have known the 7, verse 11 wasn't the right one, because you know what 7, verse 11 is. Anyway. So 2 Chronicles 17, verse 11. Where we are told in that passage that Arabs, along with the Philistines and some others, the story goes on to say, gave tribute to the honored king of Israel at that time, King Jehoshaphat. And you'll find the Arabs and the Philistines worked close together in several different stories in the Bible. And just a generation later, we find those same Arabs and Philistines come at war against Jehoshaphat's son. His name was Jehoram. And later still, we find that just another generation or two after that, God gave strength to the young boy that became a king. His name was Uzziah, to fight those two entities and beat them. And that would be in the 8th century BC. Most of the Arabs are descended from Ishmael. And I'll put my guess that some of the families or nations that would have come from Ishmael today. And if you can read that small print up there. Ishmael had 12 sons, just like Jacob did. But he's not the only father of Arabs. We've already mentioned Esau. Esau and Ishmael are linked together very closely, and they did things together after Esau, because Esau married Ishmael's daughter. So they are very closely related, not only just in blood relationships, but in the things that they did and did together. So, but there is another family tree. I mentioned this last week when we studied Abraham's family, but it comes up in the Arab family today. And we know that after Sarah died, Abraham married again. And he had another 37 years he lived. He didn't know that at that time, but he did live another 37 years. He married Keturah, and she had, by Abraham, 6 sons. Also daughters, but the sons are mentioned there. Now, let me ask, I would prefer no comments during this lesson. I meant to mention that earlier. And the reason I'm saying that now is because I'm going to ask a question. It's rhetorical. What do people mostly think of when they think of Arabs. There are a number of things that come to mind, but one is they're Muslim in faith. 2, they're wealthy because of oil. And 3, they're fanatical in their hatred of Israel and the United States. I only bring those up because a lot of people think that. And I would like to say that none of that is absolutely true of all Muslims, of all Arabs. Some define Arabs as a person who speaks Arabic. Others narrow that by saying it's somebody who speaks Arabic that's also a descendant of Abraham, and that's a better definition. But it's difficult because over the 3,800 years since then, there's been a lot of mixture. A lot of mixture between these families. So it's not as easy as it might have been able to back then to identify. Doesn't fit so neatly together. Over the next 3,800 years, they mixed together. Now, while various Arab nations have descended from Ishmael and Esau and Keturah, there are a number of countries that today we call Arab that really aren't. In fact, they may be a part of the Arab League, but their origin is not Arab. For instance, now comes my map. Whoops. My map and my pen. Syria. Today, almost all of them speak Arabic. Syria, on this map, you can see it there. The reason I used this map is for 2 or 3 reasons. They're using the names that are found early history of the world. Shortly after the flood, these are the descendants of, not all of these are descendants, but they're the descendants of some generations, not just the immediate generation, of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the 3 sons of Noah. And if you can read in the very lower right there, you'll find that the green colored ones are the descendants of Ham. The red on the top are the descendants of Japheth. And the blue are the descendants of Shem. Now, let me go to Syria. Syria, can you see that circle around Aram? Didn't work? Oh, it just was a little slow. Okay. Aram is the original name. When you see Syria in the Old Testament, in all cases, it comes from the word Aram. That's the word that's used in the Hebrew. There are 2 Arams in the Bible. One is, he was a son of Shem. The other one is, he's the grandson of Abraham's brother, Nahor. You remember that Abraham and all the family of Terah, his father, except for Haran, that died before they left Ur, they went to a place called Haran, and they stayed there until Terah, the father, dies. And Abraham and his wife and Lot moved south into Canaan, whereas Nahor stayed there and migrated slightly to the left and south. And he becomes the progenitor of the Syrians, and his grandson was named Aram, and that's where this name comes from. And the language they spoke was very similar to that of Hebrew, and we have several phrases in the Bible that come from their language and you know it as Aramaic, Aramaic language. And parts of both the Old and New Testament are written in Aramaic. And probably the one that comes to my mind that I can relate to you is found in Matthew the 27th chapter and verse 46, where Jesus is on the cross and he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that first part of what I just said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, is Aramaic. So that's the one that came to my mind in a way. A couple of things I want to mention before going any further. Way off to the right, I'll put a little dot here. Down by Elam, you don't see it yet. Down by Arphaxad. All right, that's where Abraham come from. He goes up the Euphrates River. I'll draw it, and not exactly where the river is. All right, and right there is approximately where the city of Haran is located. And it's from there that Aram, or Nahor and his lineage, migrate to the west and to the south. And Abraham goes further south, and Lot into Canaan. There was a couple more things I wanted to mention on this map before going any further. Oh yes, Egypt. Down below it's Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim in the lower left. Let me circle it. All right. All the English words, Egypt in the Old Testament, the original Hebrew is this word. All right, Mitzrayim. And what else did I want to do on that one? Oh, just as a piece of information, I'm going to put a dot here. Do you see it up north of Aram? That's the city of Antioch, from which Paul would make all of his missionary journeys. Back then it was called Antioch of Syria. Today Antioch is not in Syria, it's in Turkey. Here, Turkey now has this little finger that comes down here. You see it there? That comes down into the Mediterranean Sea there for a short distance, and Antioch is located inside of that already. Already. Let's go on. There's a lot of Antiochs. There's two in the Bible. That's correct. There are a lot of Antiochs. In fact, there are 16 of them. All of them in the Turkey area. And that's why you have to say Antioch of Pisidia, which is the other Antioch in the Bible, and Antioch of Syria. Just like you'd have to say of Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean Sea, and Caesarea Philippi way up north in Israel. So they had to have identifiers or some kind of attachment to help identify which of those cities that are named the same. And in the case of Antioch, there was a king who had a wife, a queen, whose name was Antiochia. And all these cities are named after her. Just a piece of information. Thank you. As far as Syria is concerned, Bible translations like the King James, the New King James, and the American Standard Version all translate it to Syria. Most of the others, like the NIV, the New Living Bible, the Revised Standard Version, New American Standard, they all leave it in its original, Aram or Aramaean. Just be aware of that. When it's always Aram or Aram is the Hebrew word that's translated Syria, or Arami means, it extends that to Aramaean in what it means. So you'll see those words if you get into the Hebrew text. Now, I'm only going to go through it today. Obviously, I don't have the time to finish this, and that's fine. I'm at a point where I can actually put the rest of this into the next lesson. But I want to finish Syria. Question I ask myself, does Israel have any Syrian in them? In their, you know that the Israelites, the Jews, weren't pure Jews. For instance, Moses married a Midian woman. Joseph married an Egyptian lady. So we have these mixtures that are going on, and we have them here in Syria as well. And I think you know the story. So there's two stories that go along with that, but they have to do with Syria, so I brought it. Where did Isaac get his wife, Rebekah? Well, Abraham had a servant. Actually, in one case, he calls him the head of his household. His name was Eliezer. And he asked Eliezer to don't take a wife for Isaac from the Canaanites. Go back home and take a wife out of there. And it says he goes to a place called Padanaram. The last part being Aram, Syria. But Padanaram meaning the plains or the plateau of Syria or of Aram. And on the map, it's not far from Haran. So it's in this area right here that we have the plateau or the plains of Aram. So Eliezer goes there, and let me read the one scripture that I have for that. It says, is that the right? Yes. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel from the Syrian from Padanaram, and his sister, the sister of Laban the Syrian. So we have here two stories that you know very well. This one that I'm talking about, Rebekah. Rebekah was the granddaughter of Nahor, Abraham's brother. And the second story is the next generation. When Jacob went to find a wife, he went to find a wife from Laban, who is mentioned in this particular verse. And he worked for 14 years to get Leah and Rachel. I want to make sure. Yes, Leah and Rachel, both of whom are Syrian now. So we have a mixture of blood here in the Jewish family. And I find it interesting. I hope you do as well. Rebekah was, as I said, granddaughter of Nahor. She was a Syrian, and both Leah and Rachel were Syrian as well. A couple comments before I close. A couple more thoughts. We generally do think of the Islam people that belong to the Islamic faith as being Arabic, but did you know that, maybe I have this. Oh, I'm glad. 90% of all Arabs are Muslim. but only 15% of Muslims are Arab. That's because the greatest population of Muslims are in southern and southeastern Asia. The biggest countries with the biggest population of Muslims is Indonesia. That's the biggest population of Muslims. India, Bangladesh, and one other. See if I can put my finger on it. And Pakistan. So not all Muslims are Arabs, by a long shot. But most Arabs are Muslim. I said I'd close with that. I'll close with this. On my trips to Israel, I've had a chance to meet Arabs as well as Israelis. And they're always very courteous. A lot of the restaurants we eat at in the trip in Israel are Arab owned. And another thing, most of the conversions to Christianity in Israel are among Arabs, not Israelis. The work of the Lord is going strong among Arab people, not just in Israel, but also in Israel. I had somebody send me a video. I don't know if that person's here this past week in an email. And somebody had sent it to her and said, "Do you know how to get this to John? I know he talks about this." So she sent it on, and it was talking about how God is moving among Muslims in their conversion to Christianity. And you know, I've had lessons on that in the past, but it's been a while. And I've been thinking lately, maybe I should have a 2-week separate to do something. I'll call it my Middle East report, but have a Middle East report on Islam itself. And what God is truly doing among the Muslims. You've heard me say before that Christianity is growing at the greatest rate of any nation in the world in the nation of Iran. Growing at the rate of 19.6% per year. That's amazing. The second greatest growth in Christianity among a Muslim population is Pakistan, which is about 17.2% per year. God is doing some tremendous things among Muslims. And I have been thinking maybe, since we're talking about the Middle East here, I'd put together 2 or 3 lessons just on what God is doing among Muslims. Especially in the area of dreams and visions. I'm hesitating whether to take the time that Paula wants me to. No, she. For instance, a man was driving a truck in northern. No, before I tell this story, we have a lady right here, Gohar, who is Armenian. She was born in Iran. Northern part, near Tehran. South, okay. But Armenia is north of Iran, and right now Armenia is having a difficulty with the Azerbaijanis next door. And so Iran is trying to take part in that as well. But anyway, these truck drivers were, 2 of them, were driving up in a mountain roads. In northern Iran, it's very mountainous. driving, and all of a sudden, their steering wheel locked, and their brakes came on, not by their effort, and they came to a screeching halt, almost going over a cliff. And the driver said to his passenger, his worker, said, "Are you all right? I don't know what happened." And they're talking to each other, and all of a sudden there's somebody knocking on their window, the door, on the driver's side door. The driver turned the window down, and the guy says, "Where's the books?" "What do you mean, where's the books?" "I'm the chief of a village 20 miles from here. And I had a dream that somebody was going to bring books. And I talked to people in the village, and everyone in the village had the same dream. And he said, go down to the road and you'll find the books. He comes down and finds this truck. Where's the books? Those two gentlemen were secretly traveling with loads of Bibles into the countryside. They had to keep away from the main traffic roads because they had Bibles. And Iran wouldn't allow that. So this was an answer to both sides' prayer. They had dreams about getting the books. The drivers were taking books to distribute to Christians secretly. That's how God, that's just one story out of many, many that are happening all over the Muslim world. God's not finished with them yet. Let's pray.